I'll wait a few seconds as people are joining us and getting settled, getting comfortable, depending on where you are, maybe having your lunch with us right now. So as you enter, I'll say a couple of brief words of good afternoon to everyone here today. Bonjour et bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Thank you for joining us for a conversation centered around Govind Gopakumar's recent book, Installing Automobility. We are thrilled to welcome today's panelists joining us from numerous time zones for what's sure to be a spirited and important reflection on mobility and sustainable transition. Concordia University's fourth space, physically located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal on unceded Indigenous land, welcomes our community of researchers, faculty members, and students in so that we might collaborate on ways to make your research initiatives and course activities publicly accessible. In light of this, we are thrilled to have the good fortune of hosting today's exchange. Those of you joining us as audience members today, welcome. I see the numbers rising. Thank you for being here today. We invite you to add any commentary that you might have throughout into the chat if you have comments or reflections as you're listening to the conversation. But if you would be so kind as to make our moderator's life a little bit easier, if you do have a question that you'd like the panel to address, we ask you to please use the Q&A feature proper so that our moderator can keep a close eye there, specifically for the question period towards the end of the event. On that note, it's now my pleasure to pass things over to our moderator, Professor in Geography and Environment at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, David Sadoway. Over to you with David. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Anna, and just welcome to the broader audience out there who installed themselves online. And hopefully you've also installed Govind's book on your hard drive of your computer. It is the great thing about this book, besides the contents, and as we'll find out a little bit more today, some of the provocative and interesting ideas that Govind's come up with, is the fact that it is open access. So it's freely available to you through the kind assistance of a foundation. And it's available on the MIT Press website. And Govind tried to mail me a copy. I didn't receive it yet, the hard copy, but I, of course, have enjoyed installing it on my computer and taking a look at it. So it's got 7 really interesting chapters. I mean, just the title itself is very provocative, right? Installing Automobility, the emerging politics of mobility and streets in Indian cities. And some of you who were on earlier saw a video running. Govind, besides being a prolific writer, there's the book, yes, get the plug in there. Besides being a prolific writer, is also a filmmaker. And that film was it from The Social Life of a Bus? Yes. So the video clips, and so the setting is the same, both for the book and for the video. And so check that out as well. I think that's also available online and it's freely accessible. And in both cases, the research is centered on Bengaluru. I should just say from the beginning, I'm also speaking online from the Kwantlen Polytech University, and our campuses are located on the unceded lands and waters of the Kwantlen, Katsi, Musqueam, Tawasin, Semiahmoo, Kaikut, and Kiketlan peoples, known also as the Coast Salish peoples in Metro Vancouver. And our panel today, are going to be reviewing Govind's work, are from all over the place. And so I'll introduce each one of them. I just wanted to, before I do that though, is just say some of the things that I got from the book. I know Govind because I worked for him after I just finished my PhD in Hong Kong at the University of Hong Kong in urban planning and design. Govind invited me to come to l'Île de Montréal, to Concordia on the island of Montreal, and also known as the Mohawk territory, and then very quickly to go back and defend my thesis in Hong Kong, and then send me to India. And so it was the second time that I returned to India in my life then, and I had a chance to do research on infrastructure, and we were looking at the politics of infrastructure in Indian cities. So I was living in Delhi and in Bengaluru or Bangalore. And so the first time I went to India, I kind of, this relates to the book, I think, I had that perception that Govind talks about in the book of the sort of foreign eyes, or the external eyes on the street, seeing this sort of this entropy, in 1 minute seeing heaven and hell on the streets. The first time I went there, I was kind of a backpacker, zippy hippie, and I was traveling with a Brit, and we came in from Pakistan, and we bought bikes in Amritsar, in the Hero, just freshly minted from the Hero bike factory. And we rode our bikes. We tried riding our bikes through we wanted to get to a festival and to cross 2 states on bike. And we very quickly realized that the bike is at least in that part of India, was the lowest end of the totem pole, having to sometimes jump off the road in front of screaming trucks or buses, right? And then, subsequent journeys in India, sometimes sitting in the front of the bus, I realized, oh, now I'm in a space where there's lots of power, and seeing the oncoming drivers, madly dashing to the horn of the oncoming bus, right? So, but Govind reminds us in his book that this kind of perception, the superficial perception, whilst being one ground truth, is is too much on the surface, and he digs deeper in his book, and I think that he's trying to dispel some of these surface perceptions, but he's also trying to understand really what's going on the ground, and in particular in Bangalore. And he's also trying to look at this intersection of infrastructures, right? And so he uses some very powerful theoretical approaches, right? Science and technology studies. Govind's, that's very much part of his professional life, and that STS, or that science and technology studies approach, he links it with something. He looks at the dramas in Indian cities, right? So he looks at this sort of the drama of infrastructure, and he also looks at the rhythms of the city and how the rhythms are changed with automobility, with this massive rise in automobility, right? He identifies those statistics in the book, and I just jotted them down again, and again he wants us to look beyond the surface of this, but a 325% growth in autos, in vehicular traffic in Bangalore, right, over a 15-year period. Imagine that, right? So from 2001 to 2015, a rise from 1 million to 5.5 million vehicles, right? And these numbers, we can talk about these raw numbers. What does that mean in terms of this growing urban region? But especially the specific sites of where infrastructure touches down. And so I think that's the thing that amazed me about going through the book again. It brought me back to doing research in India, to walking the street. We called it, Govind and I called it, street to suite research, right? We were not just walking the streets, but we were also talking to the power brokers in the suites, right? And so Govind does that in his book in an incredible way. And then he also gives us some hope, right? There's a sense of perhaps becoming cynical. Oh no, this is what's happening around the globe. More cars. How can we fight this car culture? This automobility. And he talks about automotive citizenship as a way to, as maybe an antidote, a vaccine, as it were, these days, since we're talking about vaccines. He talks about unlocking regimes of congestion, of mobilizing pro-poor, non-motorized publics, right? And of taking back the streets. So many of these ideas, I think, go well beyond what's happening in Bengaluru. And so our panelists today are going to add some insights into that. And so that's what I promptly want to do, we're going to work this in 3 rounds today, and we will invite the wider audience at the end. So the first round will be, I will introduce each panelist, and then they're going to kind of give a quick review. This will be the review round of Govind's work. And then Govind will respond in the second round. It'll be more of a dialogical round. And that's where the 4 panelists, again, I'll go in the same order, and they'll have questions of Govind's work, and perhaps some provocations, and Govind will respond to those. Hopefully. Okay, so with that in mind, and then for the wider audience, if you have questions, as Anna reminded us, you feel free to type into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, I believe. And if there's any other comments, just let us know, okay? So that's kind of how we'll work it. I'd ask, I guess the other audience microphones and video is locked off, so we don't have to worry about getting Zoom bombed, I guess, right? So I'll begin then. I'd like to introduce Manisha Anantharaman, and she's an associate professor of justice, community, and leadership at St. Mary's College of California in the United States. And her work very much touches on some of these justice issues in not only in India, but I think they have ramifications well beyond. And so I would like to ask Manisha to take a go at your perspective on Govind's work, please.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, David. And hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to comment on this book and to discuss it with y'all. I want to start off by locating myself in relation to this book and how I read it. So even though I live in California now, in Oakland, in unceded Ohlone territory, I grew up in Chennai. And I used to work in Bangalore, which is also was my site for a lot of my research that I did. And I've spent all my life in India as a precarious pedestrian as well as a public transit user. I do not know how to drive. I don't have a driver's license here in California, nor in India. So my experience of the city, getting to school, getting to college, has always depended on the good graces of the public transit systems, the good graces of motorists to not hit me while crossing roads. I've scampered home from, buses at 9 p.m., clutching my keys in my hands and, looking this way, that way, running back home, hoping that I'll be safe. So my experience of the city is from this positionality of not having access to automotive citizenship because I cannot drive. And so when I was reading this book, I must say at moments, it touched a nerve. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, I thought I would point out one of my favorite sections from the book, which I believe is in chapter 5, where Govind talks about the experience of traversing an intersection in the area of Nayandahalli, which is in the westish of Bengaluru. And there's a new flyover that has been built in this area, and it is meant to ease the movement of automobiles. At the same time, at the lower level, there is supposed to be movement that is available to non-automobile or non-automobile, kind of mechanically supported movers of the city. And in a beautiful section, he talks about how it feels to traverse this intersection, the lower layer of it, which is supposed to be meant for pedestrians as a pedestrian. And you're left in tenterhooks as he describes how suddenly the sidewalk ends and there's a pothole that's been dug up in order to replace the water pipes, and how you keep moving and you keep walking, and suddenly you realize it ends. You're facing oncoming traffic and you have no option but to run across the median or to, go back the way you came. And indeed, this is the experience of millions of people traversing not just Bengaluru, but a number of other rapidly changing Indian cities where the imaginary of how to plan mobility in the city privileges automobile transport, while a significant subsection, even a majority of the population, still needs to get around by foot. And the first thought that came to me as I read this book was, whose lives are disposable? Whose lives are cheap in the Indian city? And a statistics that is perhaps left out of the book, but worth thinking about, is also the number of injuries and the number of deaths and the general climate of fear that exists around traversing streetscapes and roadscapes in Bengaluru, as well as in other Indian cities, which I think is worth thinking about in relation to the broader urban imaginaries, infrastructures, and governance arrangements that are emerging. So beyond my kind of personal relationship to the street and the road, I'm also approaching this book as a scholar. And I am a scholar of urban environmental politics. And fundamentally, I'm interested in understanding the cultural and democratic politics of urban space, infrastructure, and sustainability. And I have looked at how urban elites and the new middle classes in Indian cities, particularly in Bangalore, think about and act on urban space and urban environments, and how the consequences of their actions for other social groups, whether those be waste pickers who I've worked with in the city of Bangalore, or pedestrians or cyclists, and how these other social groups resist, negotiate, and appropriate the activism, the civic activism, the environmental activism of the middle classes and the elites. And indeed, installing Automobility offers a lot of insight into how the class politics of urban space and infrastructure scapes in the city of Bengaluru. And I think in particular, what the book does very well is offer some texture and some fine-grained analysis of the diversity of actors who are involved in producing automobility in the context of Bangalore. For example, in chapter 4, Govind does a really amazing job kind of distinguishing between Sarkarada Bengaluru, which is the state, and what is the state's, the chief minister's stakes in this context, versus brand Bengaluru, the IT entrepreneur subject, versus Namma Bengaluru, the more vernacular as well as the pro-poor coalitions involved in automobility. And he focuses on when do their agendas come together and when do they fall apart. And this indeed also then offers us an examination of what are those moments in which this regime of congestion or automotive citizenship being privileged in the city of Bangalore is disrupted. Where are those openings available for us to imagine a different way of moving about the city that is more fair, more equitable for the aged, for those who cannot afford automobile transport, for the disabled, who are a population completely ignored in the context of automobility or mobility conversations in the Indian city. And finally, I'll end by saying that I think another very interesting aspect that the book points out is that when the new middle classes or maybe even the urban elite, the ideal subject, the citizen that the city is planned for and made for, when they get interested in public transport, the idea is you go towards a metro, world-class transportation, versus fortifying existing public transit networks around the bus. Or you move towards air-conditioned buses versus subsidizing bus routes that serve low-income populations. So I think Govind's book also gives us some insight into how gentrification operates in relation to transportation in Indian cities, which I believe again addresses a gap in the literature to do with the cities not just in India but more broadly in the global South or Southern urbanism. And I think this, in addition to his use of science and technology studies and the distributed agency that exists across people and the things they make, which in turn make them, also makes his book a really important and interesting read, and in addition to the corpus of work on urban geography and urban studies in India. So I'll stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Manisha. And as I mentioned before, for those of you who are just joining us, we're just doing 2 rounds. So the first round, we're with Govind Gopakumar, and we're talking about his book, Installing Automobility. And so with this first round, our panelists are going to sort of give you quick review, quick impressions of the book, and then the second round will be more dialogical, more kind of questions, and Govind will respond to those. So in the next panelist is Manisha. Sorry, that was Manisha. This is Tanu Priya Uteng. And Tanu is Senior Research Planner focused on mobility at the Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo, Norway. And so we're gonna cross a continent away from Manisha, and then we're gonna cross an ocean to join Tanu well, I was joking this morning, it's probably very dark normally in Oslo, even though the fjord is not as deep there. But please, Tanu, take it, your take on Govind's book, please.
Thank you, David. So I'll start with my presentation. And first of all, I would like to thank Govind for writing this book, because it takes a lot of years of experience and reflection to write something what he has written. And being an engineer, he needs an extra, tap on the back, because it's not easy to write this book coming from the engineering profession. And it's very much needed. So I'll start with things. First of all, I'll start with who is this book meant for? And I would say anybody who's interested in the topic of urban design, of city planning, policy making, automobilities, the gamut of mobility studies. And it's not mobility per se, traversing from A to B, but the potential of movement. Even if you're not moving, but you have the potential of movement. And that's what is caught under the term of mobilities. So anybody who's interested in this sort of very diverse topics should be reading this book, just to get a flavor of how this entire topic is a jigsaw puzzle. It's not one thing. You cannot attack or curtail automobility or vehicular growth through one approach. It's a very tight conjunction of multiple layers. And an engineer would typically not really think or approach this topic from a sociological point of view. And a sociologist will not approach it from road designing point of view, but these two need to converge and merge. And that's what Govind has very, very deftly achieved in the book. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. And the things which I would like to start with is he talks about men of privilege. He talks about historic, the historicity of policy making, the historicity of launching automobility, of shaping and chiseling our own imagination of what a modern life, what a successful life is meant to be. And that's very important to understand, to attack it back. Because what's happening in the global north is that the sort of pivotal point in the graph was achieved, and now it's going back to creating livable cities, more built around walking and bicycling and active spaces, which is still not happening in Asia, in Africa, or in Indian cities, as we are discussing Indian cities right now. And that's very important to highlight that the history of our city planning, which Govind talks about how the lakes were connected. And once because of these vehicular growth and in order to create roads and all these, they were disconnected, and how it led to flooding and the consequent traffic complete breakdown of the city. And that's very important to understand how it has been attacked. And that is something which needs to be discussed at the level of, designing a road. But I don't think engineers are ever taught to think through these things. Like the history of city planning is a completely different topic out of domain of mainstream discussion, which is a fallacy in itself. Then you come to the nuances of the society. It's not a flat society. We do not provide affordances or equal opportunities to all strata, which includes women. I mean, 50% of the population you're excluding out. Then you add the layer of income and class and age, disability. So basically what is happening is that you're putting 80% of the transport or urban infrastructure money available to serve 8 or 10% of the population. And there's a huge mismatch, huge. And it's evident to everyone, but it's somehow not really making a dent into policy making and designing. So this book addresses that in a very conclusive manner. And although it doesn't quote facts and figures from traffic accidents, but these numbers are easily available. Anybody who digs into it will find it and will. So what Govind very deftly does is he outlines the chasms. These are not gaps. These are chasms. These are huge, huge gaps. And then to connect the sociology of movement with the political and technical interlocking, because there's so much focus on the technical domain of urban planning and transport planning that it forgets that it's basically planning for people. It's not planning for cars. It's not planning for infrastructure. It's planning for people. And whom is it serving? Most of the time, these policies never question who is our clientele here? Whom are we designing this flyover for? And whom is it going to serve? So basically, you're stopping, rickshaws plying on many flyovers. Rickshaws cannot ply. But if you look at the transport mode usage, women, for example, are primarily public transport users, or they are using non-motorized public transport like rickshaw and all. So you are just taking away access from a huge share of the population. And nobody has put a number on the economic loss when you hamper access to this huge share of population. Women are not going to colleges, they are not going to employment. Even the absolute number of women entering the employment market, job market has increased. The growth rate in India has decreased. Nobody's talking about that. Women are getting educated, but they are not accessing the job market because of issues like harassment on public transport, low accessibility levels, non-provision of public transport after certain hours, and a forced automotive, automobile-based citizenship, which doesn't come easy to the female population. And not only because of access to, infrastructure or access to a car or driving license, but also a matter of preference. I live in a country where 90% of women hold driving license, but they are not driving. 90% are not driving. It's not the preference. That is very subtle definition to understand. So when you talk about climate policy making, energy emissions, and a low carbon transition, you already have a ready-made clientele you're not taking care of. And then you are trying to, frame the entire discussion in technology again, like electric car and electric buses. But before you launch these, you have to actually understand how is the city operating? Where are the areas where different population groups are working? When you take a slum and relocate it in the periphery, and the people who are actually working in the city center have no way to access it, you're not providing any sort of public transport connection. There's no way low carbon transition is going to happen, because the moment that person or the family can afford a scooter, it will buy a scooter and they will use a scooter. It will stop their sustainable travel behavior. And these are the kind of layers which the book talks about. It also talks about very nice theoretical approach, which is important, like actor network theory. And actor network theory is like how an actor, how a subject is interacting with a network. But then again, the social transition system. So how the big regimes or the big decisions is influencing these actors. And then this discussion on social practice theory, that's how the macro and the micro, how the macro and the client interact with each other. It's very important to understand, which is not really understood, because somehow we feel that the society is a flat society. Everybody will respond to infrastructure interventions in the same way, which is not true at all. It's as far from reality as possible. Govind also talks about the institutional fragmentation in policy making, and this is very essential. It's very essential to understand how access to employment, health, and education is tightly linked with provision of transport infrastructure. And that's not really discussed much. I mean, we are all working in silos, and we have been talking about this since God knows how many years, but nothing really is happening. And one thing that I would like to add on is the planning education, is the engineering education itself is faulty. It's not teaching the students to think through these diverse, puzzle pieces. And I think Govind's book should be made sort of mandatory study at some level, maybe third year bachelor or fourth year bachelor, and definitely at master's, because that's the kind of reflection you need to start with. When you start providing, let's say, a very harmless bicycle lane, this bicycle lane could lead to gentrification, could lead to, low-income population being pushed out. So there was a reason why in New York, low-income population actively said, we don't want bicycle lanes because it's leading our community to be pushed out. And that kind of, interlocking is very important to understand. I would also like to say about, very briefly, about the whole smart mobilities agenda. There is a fascination with smart all over the world, but in India, it's a policy focus. Prime Minister has said that there will be 100 smart cities in India. And what they're doing under these smart cities, so-called smart, is basically just technology play. It's not really more than that. And it's very important to understand, for example, in the case of Bangalore, there are female bus conductors. And the presence of these female bus conductors has a huge impact on female passengers. And there's an agency which is being established. It's finally actually making the public transport field accessible to women at all levels. the moment you install smart ticketing, these female conductors will be taken off. So it's very important to understand those sort of interactions as well when you talk about smart mobility. Then again, I read, it was, I think, 3-4 years back, I presented at IHS Bengaluru, and the very same day, there was an article in Economic Times that however successful Bengaluru as a city becomes in terms of Silicon Valley of India, unless it becomes attractive to live in, it increases its competitiveness, it won't be a world-class city. And you all can guess what was the first deterrent. It was the traffic situation in Bengaluru. So this is a huge problem. It's not only affecting daily lives or the issues of justice, which engineers might look down upon. I mean, it's too soft a thing to even discuss, but it's actually, it will hamper the competitiveness of the city and the economic growth. So it's not just a matter of justice, but it's also a matter of pure economics and money. And that how these two work together is very important to reflect on, which is reflected on the book. So I quite enjoyed reading the book, and I agree with a lot of issues being raised. And also it opens avenues for what can be taken further. What can you discuss based on this? So one of my areas of research is gendered mobilities. And I think there was a lot of important discussion how women get affected by it across class, culture, race, whatever, like income, education. But there is a culture of fear and personal insecurity, which is propagated and which is ignored in this entire agenda of development. And that is something which I think should be more discussed and taken forward, because the groundwork has been laid in this book. But when you look at the Bengaluru's siliconization and the number of female engineers working there and the amount of young women active in the employment market, in order to actually make sure that Bengaluru thrives as a city, it's not only important, it's absolute necessity to ensure that mobilities is considered in its wholesomeness. It's safe, it's affordable, it's accessible, and it's available when it's needed. So these sort of interplay of 4 A's, I would say, is the next step for different groups. And you can do the same kind of analysis at different levels. So macro, meso, and micro, and then try to put down to the policymakers, this is how you should look at it. This is your problem at macro level, and this is the solution at the micro level. And all sorts of, that's the tech hub. It's just the wish of the policymakers, and the solution will be provided, but the wish and the imagination is lacking. And I think that has been very beautifully brought forth in installing Automobility.
Oh, there we go. Nice. A reminder for those who are joining. Tanu, thank you. And it's maybe the second edition, you would be the lead author and in a second version, and focusing on some of these additional lenses, right? Which Govind touches on, but obviously he can't dig into given the limitations of space. I think there's 7 chapters in Govind's book, right? And so thank you for those important insights and I think provocations as well, just for the audience, right? And this idea of Govind being, I always thought of Govind as a Renaissance engineer, right? He's, the IIT engineers, right? Some of the IIT engineers are pulled into what I call Silicon Valley, right? Silicon, in whether it's in the, San Francisco Bay Area, where 2 of our guests are today, or whether it's India's Silicon Valley. And I think that it's important to critique this notion of smart cities, right? I mean, haven't cities always been smart? Hasn't there always been intelligence in cities? That's nexus of globalization, culture, goods, services, interchange. It's just bizarre that suddenly the Silicons are introducing the smart city, right? So speaking of Silicon Valley, the next reviewer and panelist is Jason Henderson. Jason is working out of San Francisco, I believe. And where's my other bio here? Okay, so I'm clicking on Excel, right? So I'm pivoting to the wrong space. Here we go. Jason is a professor of geography and environment at San Francisco State University, and he's also authored 2 interesting books. When you first hear the title, you think, well, maybe, is this about kickboxing? It's about street fights, right? And it's not about kickboxing. It's about the contestations of space, the very things that Govind is talking about in his book, and kind of references, right? Jason's done a focus on street fights in San Francisco, and he's also looked across the Atlantic to Copenhagen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jason.
Thank you, David. And I just want to echo Manisha's comments about transit justice and Tanu's comments about designing the city around the needs of women, and particularly the mobility system. I think those are 2 very strong points of this book, but things that we need to talk about. So where I come from and how I read the book. Well, I really enjoyed the book, and I learned a lot about Bengaluru, and I hope to one day get there. I agree wholeheartedly with Govind that automobility must be displaced, and I share your sense of urgency. A little bit about my research. My research examines street fights, or the politics of allocating street space and the configuration of cities vis-a-vis urban mobility. And I'm also interested in narratives of future urban mobility and the political contestation of competing narratives, particularly between a more social democratic or progressive left vision of mobility and what that might look like, compared to and contesting this narrative coming out of Silicon Valley, which I'm in the middle of. I mean, I can look out my window right now and see a driverless car, using my city as a guinea pig for surveilling the street and so on. So don't get me started on that. While we use different vocabularies in our writing, mine is aligned probably more with critical geography, and Govind's, yours is science and technology studies. I find a considerable amount of overlap and similarity, and that we're kind of talking about the same thing, just using different terms and maybe entry points in our analysis. And chapter 4 really resonated with my observations about car politics in Copenhagen and San Francisco and Atlanta and elsewhere. I especially related to chapter 4 and the kind of normative visions of the 3 different overarching factions in the debate over the future of mobility. And it parallels my framework of a progressive left, a neoliberal, and a conservative right framework. I found a lot of similarities of official Bengaluru to what I've called the automobility growth machine, where political leaders and construction companies and car companies and car retailers kind of group together and influence, especially at the state level in the United States, but also the federal level. Brand Bangalore, I couldn't help but think of neoliberal livability, this new round of decarbonization through reurbanization and green mobility, but distinctively private. And things like the Google buses here, the Volvo air-conditioned bus, even though it's not private per se, it kind of reminds me of that. And then the Nama Bengaluru resonates with the kind of progressive left that is very disparate, and there's all these competing interests on the left, and so sometimes it's hard to get a quorum or a consensus. Here in San Francisco and Copenhagen as well, the social justice organizations do articulate a right to the city framework and a right to the street framework, but then some struggle to get a seat at the table in the decision-making process. I also found chapter 7 to be one of my favorite parts of the book, and that I'm also focused on a politics of hope. And my research on Copenhagen was about identifying, how a hopeful and inspirational green mobility system came together. It wasn't just magical. It didn't just come out of thin air, and it did take a lot of street fights to get there. And it is under siege, they're from various directions. And so, there's similarity and difference. So I'm interested also in this idea of portability that you bring up in the conclusion. I find that while there are distinctive differences between cities and regions, with the politics of mobility, and especially the politics of automobility globally, there's also remarkably similar alignments, if you will, in the political landscape, or the techno-political landscape in different cities around the world. So that's sort of my initial take. I really enjoyed the book, and I also appreciated the vignettes and the participant observation, as I call it, the field work. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, it's the field work was a big part of the book, and I think that it shouldn't be underestimated, right? Govind is not only talking about the installation of these infrastructures, but he's also walking in the shadows of the infrastructures, talking to people on the street, right? So thanks very much. Our next panelist is Bipashyee Ghosh, and Bipashyee is a research fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex in the UK. And very much, Bipashyee, I was looking at her bio, and she's very much interested in technological transitions and transformations, right? And this is something that Govind talks about in the book. Maybe we didn't touch on it so much here, but he talks about this conception of automobility as a constellation, right? And if we think of the multiplicity of constellations that are out there, that it doesn't have to be this kind of constellation that it is right now, that there are potential alternative constellations, right? So I think that's a really useful metaphor that comes from the book. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bipashyee. Govind had just sent me a comment. So just before I shift over to Bipashyee, actually, Govind, did you mean that we should maybe consolidate the second portion of?
Yeah, we could see, depending on how, but let's be flexible.
Okay, sure. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, of course, and so Bipashyee will give her response, and then what we could do is, there's already a lot of feedback, and so one thing we might want to do is pass it over to Govind to respond to some of that before we do the questions. Would you want to do that, Govind?
Sure, I could briefly respond.
Okay, so either way, we'll just see how it goes time-wise here, and Govind and I will chat about it separately. So Bipashyee, on to you, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I wouldn't take a lot of time because I'm also interested in, the discussions that the audience will also bring in, I suppose. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to review the book. I must say that for the last 2 weeks, I was thoroughly immersed in reading the book, and I was, and most of it actually resonated with me a lot. Because so just to give a bit of a background for those who are attending this webinar. So just like, to be honest, my background is kind of very similar to Manisha's. So I will not repeat. I was going to also say that background, but I thought, okay, I will not say. So I grew up in Kolkata, which is a mega city in India. And then I moved to Europe and did my master's and PhD. So yeah, so I can talk about my lived experience. And as I was reading the book, I did the narratives, the case studies actually resonated with me as personally. But I would actually start by my take on this book is actually as a sustainability transition scholar. And I must say that it was very the kind of theoretical entry points, as well as the way Govind has looked into mobility as a system, really appealed to me in the book. And that's where I would like to kind of emphasize that, for me, one of the key takeaways for those who have not read the book is one of the key takeaways from the book, takeaway messages from the book would be that when we talk about mobility or automobility and installation of automobility, it's not just a transportation problem. So we often think about it as a transport problem. It's a mobility problem. It's an urban problem. It's also, as we touched. So the book touches on all these different aspects of democracy, citizenship, infrastructure. So even though I was introduced as someone who is specialized on technological transition, I would say that I want to see transition as I see transition as socio-technical. So it's I really emphasize with the idea that the mobility as a system is technological as much as it is political. So Govind talks about this techno-political regime and the techno-political constellation, which is really something that should be the crux of it. And I also read this book as a Global South scholar, as a scholar who is interested in looking at transitions, basically change processes in the Global South, and how that is different from the Global North in urban context. And I really felt that this book really tells the story that this is that automobility is very, very contextual. It is less so it is less about copying the West, but automobility in Bengaluru, for example, is rooted in the history, in the culture, in the politics of the city. So even though we talk about this kind of global relations, the whole influence of modernity, industrial modernity, the Western influence, and so on, but you can see the dynamics that plays out is very, very local and contextual, and it is deeply embedded in the kind of local contextual values and practices. So that is something that I feel is a very important kind of takeaway message from the book, where it brings out through the examples of either the flyover or the citizenship. You talk about how people actually experience automobility and other forms of mobility in the city. And I would also like to kind of dwell on the idea of regime, because that's something that I work with. So this vocabulary or the terminology of regime is something that I thought about a lot during my PhD. So because in transitions literature, the idea of regime is, by definition, regimes are stable configuration of rules. So we talk about regime as something in the Western societies, car-based mobility as a regime, where it's very, the autocentricity, it's very stable, the rules are very stable. And then the transition scholars have interrogated how does this regime look like in Global South? And there has been studies which found that, okay, regimes in the Global South may not be that stable. So regimes in the Global South are perhaps much more dynamic, much more complex to understand, and much more susceptible to change. So there has been arguments in the transitions scholarship where we think that, okay, change is there's an aspect of fluidity in the regimes in the Global South. So I think some of the, so when you talk about the regime of congestion, for example, in your chapter 3, I was reading it as a regime, of course, but also which is very dynamic, which is very diverse, and it's experienced by a heterogeneity of actors, both users of different class, different gender, but also how the regime is experienced by policymakers versus day-to-day users of mobility. So this diversity of actors and how they experience and their interests. How the different actors, different interests, and also the contestations within this regime is something that comes out very nicely, I feel, in the book. And you talk about automobility as a socio-technical regime that is characterized by a diversity of constituent tech policy and technological regimes. So so I think I really like that sentence in that chapter, which really encapsulates the overlaps of different regimes. So when we talk about regimes, we are not just talking about mobility regime, but we are also talking about policy and technological regimes and how they overlap and interconnect. And talking about regimes, and I mentioned the definition, I mentioned the word rules in the definition. And I want to quickly kind of clarify that rules are very, very diverse. So when we talk about rules, we can think of standards, laws, regulations, but we can also think of values and norms and practices as the kind of cognitive and normative rules. So there are different types of rules. And I really felt that in my own PhD research, as I was looking, so my fieldwork was looking into public transportation in Calcutta. And I was really looking at whether or not, and how much, to what extent, these cognitive and normative rules are changing, rather than the kind of laws and regulations, because ultimately real socio-technical transition or sustainability transition will not happen if just the rules, if just the kind of policy change happens. I think it goes much deeper. And on that respect, I want to show you a picture of, just give me a second. I want to show you a picture that I just found from, again, out of my interest of looking into, just a second. So I follow certain activist groups in Facebook, for example, who are really active in saving the tram in Kolkata. And I think this should work. Let's see. Just give me a second. Yeah, so you see the picture, which basically shows that in the streets of Kolkata, tram, you see, first of all, you see the diversity of public transportation. You see the bus, you see the tram, but what is very interesting, you see a car parked on the tram line. And that's something that is really fascinating. As I was saying, that, you know, of course there are policies and rules in place for not having cars parked on the tram line, but it is, in fact, if you think of from deeper rules perspective, where, you know, it's really goes deeper into people's values and people's beliefs, where they've, perhaps the owner of this car feels that it is not so important for the tram to move, and it's important for him because he has the car. So it's really shows the kind of disrespect of certain class of people for the diversity of modes of mobility that are present in the city, and the day-to-day operation of the city, and that is being and the day-to-day operation of the public transportation in the city. And I also want to show one another picture, which I don't know if and it's not just always about the values of users or car users, but it's also from a policy perspective. You can see that on the picture on the left, you see a bridge, and ignore the accident that happened in the bridge. So you see a picture which has broken down a couple of years ago. And this is very close to where my house is in Calcutta. So I actually feel very close to this, this bridge, and the accident really prevented this bridge from being used for several years. And it is only last week that the bridge has been renovated and the new bridge has opened. The inauguration has happened of the new bridge last week, which the picture that you see on the right. But the interesting thing to observe in this picture is that on the picture on the left, you see a sidewalk on the bridge. So the old bridge actually had a pedestrian access. And I personally feel very attached to this because all of my childhood, I walked through this bridge, and I walked past this bridge because there was a playground on the other side of the bridge, and I lived on the other side of the bridge. So I always used to walk the bridge to go to the playground. But as I saw this picture on the right from the inauguration last week, it came to me as a WhatsApp as a WhatsApp forward, and I couldn't ignore the fact that I can't see a pedestrian footpath on the bridge. So it basically prevents future generation of people like me to access the playground, which is on the other side of the bridge. So I just wanted to kind of show that, I just wanted to end by saying that the examples that Govind provide in the book which is about Bengaluru's flyovers, which is about Bengaluru's people able to or unable to use public transport, the buses, as well as the use of cars, the use of push carts. That is actually a very, very good representative of many, many cities in India. And it is a lived experience of many cities in India. So I think the case studies presented in the book is actually a very good representative of many other cities and the people and the citizens of those cities who experience automobility, installation of automobility in their cities, and how they feel excluded from it. So yeah, I just wanted to finish by saying I really enjoyed the book, and I also echo Tanu Priya's comment that this book should be, I recommend this book should be read by students, or not just students of social science, not just students, but also students, engineers, and also interdisciplinary course students enrolling in interdisciplinary course, because this really gives the breadth as well as depth of automobility and mobility as a system. So I'll end there, and yeah, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Bipashyee. It's and thank you for sharing. It's interesting to see how each of the panelists, how Govind's book has touched them in terms of their perceptions, and thank you for sharing those images, right? So I like how there's that connection with Kolkata. And agreed. My students are always complaining about expensive textbooks, right? At my university, we have we try to do free textbooks for the students. So when students hear that there's this amazing book for free, or downloadable by chat, someone had noted, I think what MIT Press does is they let you download each chapter, right? So it's not, you don't just get it as one PDF. You have to install each chapter, right? But still, that's a pretty good deal. What we're going to do now is, originally we had planned to do kind of a lightning round of questions, but I think instead, because there's so many rich insights from each of the four panelists, what I'll do is just I'll let Govind, if you're okay with this, Govind, I'll let you respond to each of those four, and if the panelists want to individually interject, then let's do that. How's that sound, Govind?
That sounds good.
Okay.
I think in the interest of time, I think that seems, and we want to keep some time for questions from audience. So I guess I can respond broadly to the comments, and I feel very heartened and thankful to the panelists, because this was partly by design, but I just feel so happy that the panelists have been very complimentary in their approach in diagnosing and interrogating the book. And I think they've come out with some very interesting ideas. So Manisha's observations on the kind of world classification of mobility, and mobility as a means of kind of demonstrating appeal that the city might hold for in the global era as a place of livability, as a place where the kinetic elite would want to come and locate themselves. And I think that certainly is a backdrop within which I think infrastructures and urban infrastructures, but especially mobility infrastructures, are entangled in that. But I think the point that Manisha made about these kinds of points of resistance and points of contestation by environmental groups, by citizens, and by grassroots groups, and that's I think I could have done a better job of kind of bringing some of that out into more kind of those contestations into more prominence. But I believe what I've done instead is focus on these kinds of everyday resistances, which are much more dispersed and often not categorizable as a purposive kind of resistance. And so the one thing that I've tried to do in that case of this elevated road over a stream is these kinds of dispersed forms of resistances, which end up kind of messing up the automobility system and not making it quite as, you know, spit and polish as the designers and would have liked to have created, and that gives it this sense that, you know, yes, I think designers have this idea that, you know, they can create this very smooth entity of where automobile flows would be seamless, but on a lived basis, and I think there are a lot more resistance from several sources: the institutional landscape, but also of you know, these historical residues that are there. And so that kind of ties to the point that I'm going to be a bit flexible here, but I think it ties really well to the point that Bipashyee made of this automobility as being a contextual kind of process. And I think the key takeaway from that I'd like to see out of this book is not so much the Bangalore story, but I think the story that automobility is so contextualized, and the politics and the social nature of the automobility is so contextualized within a historical situation. And I think that is an important understanding, like, and this is something that Bipashyee also mentions, but also Tanu Priya mentions in planning and engineering pedagogy, which I think has not been contextualized enough and lacks the attention to context. And this is something that I would agree that I think this kind of contextualized education is a necessary part of these kinds of technological interventions. But I think Tanu Priya makes a really important point about the gendered nature of the politics, the technopolitics of automobility, and that's something I think I've kind of touched upon. But I think I was reflecting on this notion of automotive citizenship and how there's this entire gendered component to automotive citizenship that unfortunately I should have done more justice to. But I do talk about, you know, how the regime of congestion and this system of power that kind of underlies automobility has a gendered component, in the fact that you know, air-conditioned buses are prioritized versus non-air-conditioned buses, which tend to be much more crowded, much more unsafe for women, and because of the possibilities for anonymous harassment to happen on board these buses. And then that kind of the harassment and the crowd that individuals experience on board these buses often becomes the tipping point for the decision of whether we need to make the investment towards a two-wheeler or even even a car, and then resulting in one more person shifting over from public transport, which they see as unsafe and crowded, towards you know what, a private car gives you a lot of freedom. It's a cocoon that you can travel in, and respect your personal space. And this is a familiar kind of argument, and unfortunately, you see that happening on a regular basis in several, not just in Bengaluru, but in several other global southern metropolises. And this is something, I think the gender dimension of this, of automobility, is something that requires attention. And I know, Tanu, your work has been informed by that. And this would be something that, maybe we could look at in the future, this aspect. And then finally to Jason, I think his points about the contestation on streets, on roads, it was interesting seeing those parallels that he mentions between the North American case, where you assume that the automobility constellation is settled, and everyone is happy with the status quo, but even in those contexts, and the similarities and the dissimilarities between the Bengaluru case, I think that was really interesting and enlightening. The question of these, thinking of what Jason would have thought about the book. There are aspects to this which I haven't touched upon, and which is the recent kind of discourse on smartification, and of the role of private entrepreneurs in Google, Uber, several other efforts in entering the mobility space and transforming the mobility space, and what often is not looked at too carefully in the reliance on these silver bullets to solve the mobility issue is questions of social political access, and I think those questions deserve greater attention. I'm going to stop here, but if there are other questions that any of the panelists have, I'm happy to take those. So any burning questions? I think Manisha has a question, so yes.
I also want to respect any Q&A questions. So David, I'll take my lead from you. If you think it's okay for me to ask my question now, I'll ask it. If not, I will.
I think we have time for one quick question from all the panelists. Just a quick one.
Ooh, quick one. All right. I'll as fast as I can. Govind, I think the question that I have, and I think this ties a little bit to what Jason brought up in his comments as well, is about the politics of hope. And in the post-1991, post-liberalization India, and what Partha Chatterjee has called kind of the post-developmentalist moment, or Vinay Gidwani calls eviscerating urbanism, where there's a growth coalition that has formed around cities, which is all about kind of making cities more competitive, more attractive as sites of investment, including what David Harvey calls the spatial fix, right? Flyovers, mega infrastructure as a way of fixing capital, enclave urbanism, gated complexes as a way of fixing capital. And the new middle classes have been kind of a critical agent or subject in the consolidation of this growth coalition thus far, whether that's through their direct advocacy or their consumption power. But I think what your book also points to is maybe some of those ruptures within these new middle classes, and maybe also a need for us to think of this group in a more differentiated or internally differentiated way. So whether those are ruptures around lines of gender, lines of ability, maybe ruptures around kind of, also environmentalist orientations. So I think a great kind of question, this is maybe where you end your book, which is, where do you see this going? Is there potential for cross-class coalitions in terms of bringing about these sustainability transitions, right? In destabilizing the regime, the way in which Bipashyee was talking about. And I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what are those opportunities to destabilize this regime, But at the same time, with the advent of Uber and Ola, and the continuous kind of cycle of creative destruction that is the work of capitalism in the context of cities, what are the push and pull factors you see playing out in the city?
Nice. Could I take all the questions and then respond? Because just in the interest of time, if there are other questions that any of the other panelists have.
Yeah, let's do that. Other questions, Jason?
Just real quick, I know I sent you an email with this question, everybody, last night, but the rate of motorization, distinguishing between the mopeds and the motorcycles, which are motorized vehicles, trucks and buses, which are motorized vehicles, and then the kind of elite private car could be, if you could finer grain separate that out, would that be a political opportunity? I'm thinking of, for example, what I've read about cities like Bogota, where the political will to reallocate space is in part due to the majority not having a private automobile, the vast majority. And so you have sort of in a democracy an opportunity. And thinking about how, I think somebody mentioned, I don't remember who it was, I think it was Tanu, mentioned that 8 to 10% are really the mobility elite in Bengaluru. So is there something there? Is there an opportunity, a window of opportunity to?
Okay, great. And did you have a question, Tanu? Yes, Tanu, and then Bipashyee.
I have a very quick question. This you can answer right away, Govind. Have you ever visited Chandigarh?
No.
You haven't? Okay. Okay, then we should drop the question, because my point was that Chandigarh was the start of modernist planning in India. That was the vision which Nehru had. This is the grand, city. I have visited Chandigarh a couple of times, and it's built around cars. It's built around, it's planned, and Chandigarh people are very proud of this city. But it's not built around anything else than, private mobility. And I'm wondering, that rupture, when you draw the line of ancient cities, ancient Indian cities which were built around connecting lakes and wells, and there was a plan, and then you go to this modernist plan, and then you see the cities, how they have evolved now. And there is a rupture point, and I would really like someone, I haven't researched Chandigarh myself, but I would really like to hear from someone who has thought about it. But that's like where did we start going wrong? That juncture, because something happened. Even when we were growing up, there were very few cars on the street, and of course Maruti came in 1986, and that changed the landscape completely. But there is something essential which we can also anchor our discussions on. This was where we went wrong, and this is where we could go back and discuss. Yeah.
Excellent point, and it touches on this idea of the new cities, right? This the sort of technocratic idea of creating the new city.
Yeah.
Actually, Govind funded me when I was in India. I had a chance to go to Chandigarh, so I was his eyes in Chandigarh, I guess. So you've indirectly been there, Govind. I ran into loads of Canadians, and they were saying, "Oh, the property values here in Chandigarh are more than they are in Vancouver." And I was like, "Wow, in Vancouver they're astronomical, right?" So anyway, Bipashyee had a question, and then that will be the end of this round. And then we have a few questions from the audience, so we can I'll let you respond to all of these questions first, and then we'll ask the audience questions.
Yeah, so I'll be very, very quick, because I was going to ask about this destabilization question, which Manisha already asked, and I would really look forward to your response on that. And actually taking on that question about destabilization, because in my current work, I am thinking of, again, going back to regimes in Global South. I feel that the question is more about opening up the regime rather than destabilization, because there is a lot of sustainable practices in cities. So, people using buses, people walking and cycling. So there is so unlike the West, I think we need to think about how to reconfigure the regime, or how to actually open up the regime. And one of the ways of opening up of the regime is for the policymakers to unlearn, to think reflexively that okay, what do we know and how can we change things? So it's about reflexive thinking. So my question to you is actually a very methodological question, and maybe this is something. So as you were kind of, I have read it that you have done very extensive, field work and observations, and spoke to a lot of people, interviewing a lot of policy professionals in Bengaluru. So I was thinking that, did you actually notice some sort of reflexivity among the interviewees you spoke to, and whether they were actually willing to unlearn, willing to open up their thought processes, willing to think of an alternative urban imaginary, and is so what is kind of an expected imaginary of future, and how an imaginary of future of Bengaluru looks like? Did you get an idea of that kind of an alternative imaginary? And secondly, actually, I will step into Tanu's shoes a bit, because I know she is the gender expert, but I'm very interested in understanding not just the kind of gender aspect of users or usability of mobility, but also the gender aspect in decision making. So whether you spoke to female policymakers, and whether you felt that female policymakers and their lived experiences of living in Bengaluru affects not just policymakers but professionals like architects or planners. If you spoke to them, whether you felt that their lived experiences really impacted their work in architecture or urban planning or decision making. So
thanks, Bipashyee.
That's my question.
Oh,
So I'll hand it over to Govind. Govind's going to. So just for the audience who have some questions, just hold on for a brief moment. But Govind's going to respond to the four panelists' provocations, questions, and then we'll go to the audience questions.
Thank you, David, and thank you to the panelists. I think these are wonderful questions, and I was trying to kind of relate them together in the interest of time. And I think it's great. I think there seems to be a lot of overlap across the questions. And I think this question of what comes next after this, and I think this is where several of you seem to be talking about, is automobility in some sense, is this quite as much a consolidated enterprise as it's made out to be? Where are the points of falling apart in some sense, the fractures within the regime, and I think yes, I think I end the book thinking of these possibility for cross-class coalitions, and here I'm led by this notion of tipping point, tipping points as being these kind of very non-linear. And here I'm borrowing from John Urry's work in kind of global fluids of automobility, thought of as this fluid, where if one characterizes this change process as being very non-linear, then we're looking for these small instances which could potentially drive a tipping point. And my sense in the steel flyover, the so-called steel flyover, was that this was one of those kinds of tipping points. But then now looking, I wrote this, 2 or 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, close to 2 years ago. And now looking, yes, I think there is a consensus around a cross-class consensus that we've had enough of flyovers, whether they're steel or concrete, or whether they're short or long. I think there is increasingly a consensus across several civil society and grassroots groups that we need to be looking at something different. And I think when you look at some of the recent interventions in thinking about prioritizing bus transit, affordable bus transit, in looking at fare-free bus transit. I think there is increasingly a realization that we don't need fancy modes of movement. We need the simple modes of movement to get us where we want. But at the same time, I think, you know, and this is where I think it relates to what Bipashyee was saying about this kind of reflexive need for reflexive learning. And in some sense, what Tanu was talking about, this kind of modernist approach to planning and to engineering, which I think still dominates, where society is considered to be this kind of entity that's without fractures, a very unified entity that whose needs can be addressed in a consolidated fashion, which I think increasingly is not the case. And so having policymakers, engineers, designers unlearn that, and to have them think of society in a very differentiated fashion, and to think of how is it that a cycle lane here could actually allow for gentrification to happen, and instead think more consultatively and think of these kinds of living lab approaches, which are more about getting multiple people to voice their concerns around urban space, about urban movement, and then having those kinds of discussions, those deliberations in a public fora, potentially could offer pathways of hope. I mean, these are, again, you know, Manisha, your argument about these being spatial fixes. Yes, I think critical scholars would see them as yet another kind of form of fixing the new forms of global capitalism in particular spaces. But then I think it's in how these fixes are negotiated that potentially there could be, and then again, these nonlinear tipping points could, you know, without predictability, bring about shifts. And yeah, that's all I think I can say at this point. So maybe we should go to the audience.
Okay, once again, Govind, you do a wonderful job of synthesizing it all and somehow weaving it together. So you've somehow managed to respond to everyone there. We do. I was just talking to Anna, and we do have some time. So what I'll do is, we've had a couple of questions that were sent in earlier. So some people have already done their homework. I guess I'm assuming they've read the book, and they've thought quite deeply about this. So let me read two questions for you. I'll do them. How about if I do them one at a time, actually, because one of them is fairly lengthy. The first, I'm not sure if they should. I'm going to name the sendees because they didn't say to be anonymous. So the first is from Arlene Zimmerman, and the question is: why is it cheaper and/or more politically expedient for governments to allow half-empty buses and increased car pollution, health costs, and increased cost of poor people falling through the cracks/ravines of the social system, rather than compared to adding some buses on more routes and doing more repair on buses? So, and then there's an added statement here. Explain the social and the economic, in, you know, air quotes, cost-benefit analysis as far as the politicians are concerned.
Could we take the questions together?
Sure.
We have about less than 10 minutes left.
Okay, so the second question is from Zvi Leva. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Zvi asks the question, actually for Govind and the panelists: what is the role of parking in these rapid transformations? How can we preserve streets as public space when they are being transformed into storage space for private vehicles? When governance is weak, we can defund, I guess this, how can we defend the public realm? Defend the public realm. So when governance is weak, how can we defend the public realm? Clearly, off-street options would be preferable, but what configurations would be best, and who should be providing these options? So those are two of the questions so far. There's also a statement that I can build questions from, but I think those two, there's plenty of food for thought with those two questions, or provocations at least.
Sure. I think quickly to answer the first question, I think Arlene's point is very well taken. And I think there's diagnosing it. I think there is an element of technocratic kind of thought that underlies, and which I think I've kind of touched upon, which underlies decision making in public infrastructure. And so, so for example, if buses may be really crowded and there may be harassment on buses. So a solution could potentially be to install cameras on board to ensure that they're safer. So buses may be running empty, yes, but actually, I mean, I think it works almost the other way also. So if buses are seen to be running empty, I think with this kind of reasoning, often those buses are taken out. And unfortunately, the few people who would be relying on those buses would not be able to access buses. But I think the buses that run empty often are the air-conditioned forms of buses, which are there also to kind of portray a certain image of the city. And so operators, bus operators and bus managers often see this as a process of showing the city to be world-class, as demonstrating an image of that would be appealing for young, socially mobile individuals who want comfortable transit options, which could potentially entice them away from the cars or vehicles private vehicles that they would rely on otherwise. So I think the question is whether it's a technocratic reasoning or this notion of, whom do we want to pitch these efforts towards? And the second point, I wasn't very clear about the question about this this notion of the public realm and
so it was linking parking in the transformation. So the first part of the question was, what is the role of parking in these rapid transformations? And there's sort of implicit in that, I guess, is how can we preserve streets as public space when they're being transformed,
right,
etc. And that's for all the panelists too.
And this is a question that I think we engage in the chapter on automotive citizenship, where the question of claims to who has claims and whose claims to public space and the road and the street space is considered important and considered to be something that needs to be paid attention to, and whether it is in terms of designs of these infrastructure flyovers and their lack of attention to the street space below, or whether it is everyday practices of driving and parking, which kind of place claims on streets that automobiles have. I think this is something that I think hasn't been recognized and needs to be recognized more. I'll stop there. I think, yeah. If the
do any of the panelists want to pipe in response to either of those two questions?
Yeah, I can just go for the parking question. It's very well studied and it's a thoroughly researched topic that the moment you curtail parking, you make it difficult to park, people switch to public transport. And like Oslo, for example, it's almost impossible or extremely expensive to park in the central areas. So the usage of public transport for commute purposes, for work trips, is very high. It's almost 42%. And this includes people across different sectors, banking professionals in their suit and ties and everything. So it's also about providing public transport. Because there's good public transport provision, people can actually stop driving, and that the government can make it stringent rules. So, but if you don't provide public transport and you stop parking, then there will be mayhem. There will be just chaos. Yeah.
I echo completely what Tanu just said. It's the same experience here in San Francisco, where we've had a pretty lively parking reform movement. But I want to throw out one other thing, because it was mentioned earlier that bike lanes are implicated in gentrification. I'm very, very familiar with that line of reasoning. But I posit that in a city like Bengaluru and other cities, off-street parking is a luxury and implicated in gentrification, but it's invisible. I think parking is a huge part of gentrification in American cities that we have just completely overlooked. If you look at the people who gentrify the urban cores, they do so with a car and with a parking space. And so it's invisible probably because of the ubiquity of the car, but I think it's an important little understood part of the urban process of gentrification in a city like Bangalore.
Okay, we have, I'm told from Anna that we're now approaching, if we're being super tight, but I do know that Govind has some comments on the book on temporalities as well. And I've heard from Anna that we do have a few minutes left. So I guess I just wrap this up with any additional comments from Govind and the panel.
I think there are a couple of questions on the Q&A.
Yeah, well, the first one was about the book, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So I think it was a question of, can we download the whole book or individual chapters? And so I believe the answer to that is the individual chapters can only be downloaded through the open access.
There are a few newer ones as well.
Some newer ones, okay. For some reason, they're not showing up on mine. Let's just see.
I think it's under
if you just switch to the open, yeah.
Ah, there we go. Thank you. I was on the answered. Okay. So, oh, great. Stephen Zavadowski's on. That's wonderful that you've joined us. So thanks to everyone. Let me see if I can get to the question. It's the last part. How can scholars and activists make human infrastructure more visible as a form of resistance against the automobility regime? Wow, that's a great question.
Make the human infrastructure more visible. So thank you, Stephen, for that question. I think thank you so much for joining us here. And this question of human infrastructure, I'm going to interpret that as in a couple of ways. And I think the way that one way would be as these would be infrastructures of everyday use in moving around the city space, and how would we think of these as forms of resistance? And I think I kind of touch upon that in the chapter on infrastructure scapes, where I speak of this neighborhood that has put up these bollards on the road in order to prevent cars and two-wheelers from accessing this kind of sheltered neighborhood space and making this road into a thoroughfare. And I think this you find in several neighborhoods in and around Bengaluru, but I'm sure there are other examples of these. And these seem very kind of often of residents trying to protect their streets and to allow pedestrian access for children to play on those streets. Those kinds of efforts have certainly happened, but I think these have been very fragmented. And what I would like to see is for these to have some kind of a plan in how they restrict access to some of these spaces on a citywide scale. So whereby there is some kind of a discussion around which are spaces that we want to keep safe from automobility, and how is it that we can keep those spaces safe, and how can we take back those streets away from this general free-for-all parking and driving wherever you want. So those kinds of things I think would certainly contribute to it, but I'd like to see those kinds of human infrastructures in some sense happening at a more of in a more networked fashion, in a fashion that is much more spread out in open space. And I think
I'm going to go to the last question in the interest of time, and thanks for that answer. And Govind's book covers more about the human aspect, but also the humanizing aspect, right, which relates to the in many ways the changed ecology of Bengaluru. The last question is there any way to get or convince men to go to work by bus rather than SUV or pickup truck? And again, I'll ask that to Govind, but also I'll invite the panel to pipe in on that as well. Is there any way to get or convince men to go to work by bus rather than SUV or pickup truck? And I have to say, in Canada, we have the renown of being the highest in the OECD. We have the largest vehicles per capita, the largest, physically largest vehicles, and the most gas guzzling. So we're renowned for that here in Canada. So it's not just an issue in Bengaluru or other cities in India or elsewhere.
Right, and this is, this is something that I'm sure maybe Tanu has a much better sense of. I've read the literature, but there's a lot of literature on masculinity and cars, and this is something that I think has been primarily written from a Western perspective. I'm not sure how much has been written on the masculinity of automobiles and automobility in Indian and other Southern contexts. But it would be interesting to know, to understand what are those points where they come together, and how is it that they can be those points of convergence and alliance, and then how can they be teased apart? That would be a great question.
So the Indian consulate is just a couple of miles from my home. And about a week ago, you mentioned when we met earlier that there were these blockade protests going on about the agricultural subsidy. And I saw one of those parades, and it was all huge, outsized pickup trucks and vehicles, and they were on the Bay Bridge, I think, trying to slow traffic on the bridge. But anyway, they were using these big, huge Macho Man trucks. I think they were rentals even. They looked like, because they were all the same.
Well, we've had the same protests in Metro Vancouver, and I think also actually, I mean, there is an interesting India diaspora connection. A lot of the, I mean, working in Surrey, where there's a large Indian diaspora, especially from the Punjab, a lot of folks are working, you see multiple vehicles in a driveway, but it's because a lot of people, entry-level immigrants, are working in agricultural sector and construction sector. So they need big trucks just in terms of that practicality. But, there's also, I've talked to Govind about the macho guys trying to show off, pick up people after class and stuff like that around my university when I'm standing at the bus stop, right? Tanu.
Yeah, I just want to say that the simplest way is to make walking, bicycling, taking public transport cool and sexy. It's just about that. What is cool? And in Indian cities, a lot of middle-class rich men are in the lycra costume with the right gadgets, the helmet and the right cycle. And you see this special class of cyclists emerging, and it's cool. So a lot of people are cycling in Indian cities now. And because they are cycling and they are the privileged people, so to say, women are also cycling, but the privileged men are cycling, suddenly cycling is becoming sexy. And there is safe infrastructure being designed for it. So it's just about that. I mean, Oslo achieved it. Oslo people don't take don't take car for their commute, working trip. Public transport is very popular, and it was through small steps, parking restrictions, good public transport supply, good biking infrastructure, walking. So it's like a nexus of things coming together, and then shifts happen. That's the same for Copenhagen and Amsterdam. It was a car-dominated city, both of them at one point, but today you won't recognize it. So
of course,
it's just about these small steps.
Yeah, of course, they're going to have to counter it with the ads from the car industry, right? The SUVs driving up stream beds and all this kind of stuff. Manisha, Bipashyee.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of second Tanu on that, because Exactly, because when we study kind of innovations and we think of transition, we only think of, radical change. But often in Indian cities, what is needed is transformation, which is rather incremental and preserving either or renewal of the systems. Because, as Tanu was saying that, okay, how can we then make public transport, cycling, walking cool again? So that's something that we need to think more about. And I think one of the things that Govind captures in the book, and which we did not get to speak and discuss a lot in this panel, is the politics of it. Because we always talk about, okay, we need to do this, we need to prevent people from parking, we need to help, we need to facilitate transportation for urban poor. But we know the reality is politicians are looking for votes, and we also know that there is a huge lobbyists and huge a different type of actors who are lobbying for not having these change. So there is a whole politics around the kind of directionality, how the directionality of change is shaped by these middle class values or self-interest driven politics. So I think that's something we need to really think more about, how politics really drives the change. And that is something we are probably kind of missing from this debate, I feel.
Yeah.
Good, another book that's in the works. Final question or point to Manisha.
Yeah, so I actually studied Bangalore's middle-class cyclists who would often talk about like cycling makes you sexier, and they would wear spandex. And I did an ethnography actually with a group called Bums on the Saddle. So, you get a good drift on what they were about. But I think one of the issues was they were unable to expand their cycling movement beyond a subculture, primarily because they didn't understand how to do mobilization of policymakers. So I think a real intervention for all of us going forward is how can we connect cultural movements with, as you said, Bipashyee, an understanding of how to do politics and how to mobilize and create these unlikely coalitions, so that as we make cycling cooler, we're also making it safer and easier to do, not just for men but also for women and many working class women and working class men do cycle. And they know those practices exist. So I think it's this, I think the idea of coalitions and building coalitions across multiple capacities, multiple identity groups, intersectionally seems to be a major takeaway also, from the final bits of Govind's book.
Wow. Okay. So I've just been blown away by the panel's feedback, and also, I mean, it was nice to meet you all as well, just to learn about your work. And for the wider audience, if you're interested in, these amazing panelists and their works, their publications, there's links on the Fourth Space site. So just go and click on the individuals, right? I mean, Jason's book about street fights, I think, are totally interesting as well, right? But all of the panelists have really interesting work that either relates directly to India, as in the case with Bipashyee and Manisha's and Tanu's work, or indirectly, right? And I think Govind does this in his work. I mean, the thing that I've always enjoyed conversing with Govind, when I was actually live face to face in Montreal, I would go into his office, and he would always make sure that he would, I could see when he was scheduling the time, because he would be like, okay, when David comes to talk, we're going to talk for 2 hours or something, right? So, and I knew he had to take a bus to get home. So, but I think that the thing that I really love about talking to Govind is the poetics embedded in his language, right? And I mean, just in the book, I wanted to end my own observation with this idea of the juggernaut of automobility is conserved, but its machinery continues to be jammed, right? I mean, isn't that poetic? And I think Govind, with this work, is again a Renaissance engineer, whose work is accessible and approachable and provocative, and he doesn't himself, give us the answer to what these movements should look like, what this alternative constellation should look like. He kind of throws that over to us, right? And I know for urban planners like myself, and also Madhav, but Badami over at McGill, we would say, what's the action, right? Planners want an action. And as a socio-technical theorist, Govind isn't going to give us that answer. He's going to provoke us and he's going to seed that. So thank you very much for doing that, Govind.
Thank you. Thank you. And could I also add, thank you, David, for conducting a wonderful panel. And thank you to all the panelists, to Manisha, Tanu, Jason, and Bipashyee for wonderfully insightful questions and for taking the time from a busy December schedule to actually read the book and to ask questions and to moderate this panel. So very grateful and very thankful to all of you. Yeah, I'll stop there.
And I think the recording will be available for public dissemination on the Fourth Space website, right?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words about that. And thanks, everybody. I know we've run over time, so I'm really appreciative of all of your precious time here, the panelists as well as the audience. I just wanted to start by apologizing. We did have a glitch that we didn't realize until the very end in terms of having the chat open for the folks here. So we're really apologetic about that. I'm sorry you didn't have that extra interaction available to you until the very last half hour. But hopefully you did enjoy the conversation, the discussion. As you could see, typically at Fourth Space, when we organize an event with numerous panelists, we plan for a quick prep call of 30 minutes, just to give you an idea with this group of people who are so engaged and so incredibly willing to share their expertise. That prep call ended up being an hour and a half, I think, in the initial session. So I think we could have kept going here. It's just been a fascinating kind of discussion for us to witness. So thank you all to the panelists for your important insights and more generally your time and your energy that you shared with us today. And a special thank you, David, for your stellar moderation skills. And of course, Govind, a friend of Fourth Space. It has been a pleasure, as always, to collaborate with you. And audience members, we really appreciate your time and participation. I'll remind you, yes, that a recording will be available on concordia.ca/4, the number 4. And it's currently available on Facebook. If you're on Facebook, it's at CU Fourth Space, Concordia University Fourth Space. If you're interested, come back here at 3:30 when we're running another event on sustainability today, a conversation on energy-related greenhouse gas emissions post-COVID-19. So we'll see you back here in half an hour for some of you. On that note, I wish the rest of you a very good evening and good weekend. And thanks again for your generosity. Speak to you soon. Bye.